How World War II made the United States the richest nation on Earth. In 1945, as much of the world lay in ruins, one nation stood untouched, overpowered, and unimaginably wealthy. The bombs had stopped falling, but for the United States, the real explosion had just begun, not of destruction, but of economic dominance. World War II is often remembered as a story of battles, generals, and political leaders, but behind the gunfire was a quieter, more powerful force shaping the future: industrial production. Before the war, the United States was still climbing out of the Great Depression. In 1939, unemployment hovered around 17%. Factories were idle, banks were cautious, the American economy was fragile. 6 years later, the U.S. would emerge not only victorious, but holding nearly half of the world's total industrial output, 2/3 of the world's gold reserves, and the strongest currency on Earth. No other war in history had transformed a nation's economic standing so dramatically. The key wasn't just winning the war, it was how America fought it. When war erupted in Europe in 1939, the United States was still officially neutral, but American factories were not. Through programs like Lend-Lease, the U.S. became the arsenal of democracy, supplying Britain, the Soviet Union, and other allies with weapons, vehicles, food, and fuel. By 1945, America had sent more than $50 billion worth of aid, equivalent to over $700 billion today. And that aid wasn't just generosity, it was an economic engine. Factories that once made refrigerators and cars began producing bombers, tanks, and ships. The numbers were staggering. The U.S. produced over 300,000 military aircraft during the war. It built 88,000 tanks and 2.6 million trucks. American shipyards launched a new cargo ship called a Liberty ship in as little as 4 days. This scale of production had never been seen before. It required massive government contracts, which meant guaranteed payments to businesses. Companies grew rapidly, reinvested profits, and expanded capacity. Between 1940 and 1945, U.S. industrial production nearly doubled. Unemployment didn't just fall, it disappeared. By 1944, unemployment was under 2%. War spending reached nearly 40% of U.S. GDP at its peak. But unlike many nations that destroyed their own infrastructure in battle, America's factories, cities, and transportation systems remained intact. The war stimulated growth without leveling the homeland. While Europe and Asia lost factories, railroads, and entire cities, America gained new plants, new technologies, and a workforce trained in large-scale production. War doesn't just move armies, it moves money. Before World War II, global financial power was centered in Europe, especially London. But the war drained European economies. Britain, once the world's leading creditor, became deeply indebted. The United States moved in the opposite direction. As allied nations bought American goods, they paid in gold or borrowed from Washington. By 1945, the U.S. held about 2/3 of the world's gold reserves. That gold mattered because global currencies were tied to it. In 1944, as victory approached, 44 nations met in New Hampshire at the Bretton Woods Conference. There, they built a new financial system around the U.S. dollar, which would be convertible to gold at $35 an ounce. This effectively made the U.S. dollar the backbone of the global economy. From that moment forward, international trade, loans, and reserves would revolve around American currency and American financial institutions like the World Bank and the IMF, both created under U.S. leadership. The war didn't just make America rich, it made the world financially dependent on America's stability. One might assume that when the war ended, the economic boom would collapse. After all, military contracts would disappear. The opposite happened. Factories that had mastered mass production turned their focus to civilian goods. Soldiers returned home with savings. The GI Bill gave millions access to education and home loans. Pent-up consumer demand exploded. In 1945, the United States accounted for roughly 50% of global manufacturing output. Europe and Japan, devastated by bombing, needed American machinery, vehicles, and materials to rebuild. The U.S. didn't just sell goods, it financed reconstruction through the Marshall Plan, sending $13 billion, about $100 billion today, to Western Europe. That money often came back to American companies through contracts and trade. In other words, America funded the rebuilding of its future customers. This created a cycle of growth: production, exports, profits, investment, more production. From 1945 to 1973, the U.S. experienced what economists call the golden age of capitalism, with strong wage growth, expanding middle-class wealth, and rising global influence. World War II did not simply end a depression, it reorganized the global economic hierarchy. The United States emerged from the war with the world's strongest industrial base, the dominant global currency, massive gold reserves, minimal infrastructure damage, and unmatched technological capacity, while competitors were rebuilding from rubble. The war acted like an enormous government-funded industrial acceleration program, one that scaled American production, strengthened its financial system, and positioned it at the center of global trade. Victory on the battlefield mattered, but the real transformation happened in factories, shipyards, and financial agreements. The United States didn't just win the war, it won the peace that followed. World War II was humanity's darkest hour, but for the American economy, it was the moment the engines of history turned, and one nation rose from a crisis not just victorious, but economically unstoppable.